with Hugh Edwards.
Tonight at 10, the final battle lines are drawn as two candidates fight for the keys to the Élysée Palace. Macron and Le Pen will contest the final round for the French presidency, pushing aside the traditional mainstream parties.
Premier, deuxième tour, c'est pareil.
As Marine Le Pen promises a new start for France and a day of reckoning for the EU, the nation's leaders line up to back her rival.
L'extrême droite diviserait profondément.
The far right would deeply divide France. It would stigmatise some of our fellow citizens because of their origins or religion. It would undermine our liberty and the Republic.
We'll have the latest on the campaign as Marine Le Pen steps down as leader of her party, the Front National, to focus on the presidential campaign. Also tonight, Jeremy Corbyn campaigns in Scotland. He tells trade union members that they're part of Labour's DNA. A delay in plans to tackle air pollution until after the election. Ministers are accused of pure political expediency. A special report from northern Iraq, from a former IS stronghold where the militants are losing ground.
IS were right about one thing though. This is a place of reckoning, but it's the place of their defeat. They've now been driven more than 100 kilometres from here.
And one of the enduring images of this year's London Marathon. We speak to the runners who made their own headlines.
Coming up in Sports Day on BBC News, at an expectant St James's Park with one more championship win the goal, could Newcastle United seal a place back in the big time?
Good evening. France has now entered a period of intense political campaigning between Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, the two remaining candidates for the presidency. It is a race that's already transformed the old patterns of French politics, with potentially significant consequences for the future of France and the European Union. Well, the final voting figures for that first round were released today, and they gave the centrist Monsieur Macron 24%. His rival Marine Le Pen of the Front National took 21.3%, and the outgoing socialist president, François Hollande, said today that only Monsieur Macron, in his view, would defend the true values of the French Republic. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, has the latest for us.
Emmanuel Macron looking presidential last night. A bit prematurely, perhaps. There's a lot of glad handing still to be done, 2 weeks to go before the final vote. Financial markets and Brussels may think President Macron is a done deal. But she doesn't. Marine Le Pen, Macron's rival for president, his rival for French voters' trust. A welcome visitor on market day in the forgotten town of Rouvroy. She's the people's president, she says, with welfare policies to match. EU to the back of the queue. Madame Le Pen wants out of the euro. She's anti-big business too.
It's exactly these images that Marine Le Pen will be chasing throughout her presidential campaign. Her intended message, she's a woman of the people, while her political rival, Emmanuel Macron, is a remote Parisian elitist.
Last night's election showed a divided France. Marine Le Pen did well in the north and southeast, areas with high unemployment and low wages. Emmanuel Macron dominated in wealthy areas and large cities like Paris and Bordeaux, where his pro-business, pro-EU liberal platform resonates. Emmanuel Macron was in Paris today, keen to display his statesmanlike credentials, remembering victims of mass killings in Armenia. And while his rival hugged and kissed her way through the crowds today, Mr. Macron had onlookers behind cordons. Only the press were allowed near. Political gloves are off. For both candidates, this is the fight of their professional life. They need to win voters outside their traditional support base to make it to the top. Who can pull it off? I plan to abstain, this man told us. I don't like either of the candidates.
And for the second round, I will vote for Macron, even if I don't want him as a president, but I want him more than Marine Le Pen.
And France's political establishment, including its current president, has urged all voters to do the same.
L'extrême droite diviserait profondément.
The far right would deeply divide France. It would stigmatise some of our fellow citizens because of their origins or religion. It would undermine our liberty and the Republic.
Aware of her party's divisive reputation, Marine Le Pen had a surprise announcement tonight. She said she was stepping aside as president of the National Front to run for president of all of France. Emmanuel Macron still has a race to win. This is an all-or-nothing campaign for both candidates. And in true French style, this promises to be passionate and dramatic.
Let's go live to Paris tonight and talk to Katya, who's there for us. You've been spelling out there, Katya, what's at stake for France in this election, but what about the rest of the European Union?
Well, there's a lot at stake for the European Union and beyond. France is a political and economic heavyweight in Europe and outside as well, and that's why there's so much world attention on these elections. If Emmanuel Macron is president, well, the international financial markets, they love that idea. They surged this morning. He's pro-business and he's pro-international trade agreements, pro-EU too. So Brussels is absolutely delighted. He wants more EU integration. This could make him a tricky partner in Brexit negotiations, of course. European Union for him comes above all else, but he's a former Minister of the Economy and he's unlikely to say no to a favourable trade agreement for the EU and Britain. If we look at Marine Le Pen, a very different prospect. Of course, if she's president, she would be the champion for Eurosceptic populist nationalist movements across Europe and beyond. But Brussels is afraid of her. She wants to pull France out of the euro and hold a referendum on France's European Union membership. She's a big fan of Brexit, but if France leaves the EU, the whole European project could collapse, and that would impact the UK as well. At the very least, it would leave Brexit talks and talks of a future trade deal hanging in the air.
Katya, once again, thanks very much. Katya Adler there with the latest on the French presidential race there in Paris. Well, Jeremy Corbyn has been campaigning in Scotland today, where Labour held just one seat in the general election of 2015. Mr Corbyn was addressing the Scottish Trades Union Congress, where he said the Labour government would repeal trade union legislation passed by David Cameron's government. The same audience heard the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, insist that the election in Scotland was a two-horse race between the SNP and the Conservatives. Sarah Smith, our Scotland editor, has more details.
All these Labour supporters know Jeremy Corbyn has to win back huge numbers of voters from the SNP if he's to stand a chance of winning this election.
Do you want to vote for the SNP, who want to fight for another unwanted and unnecessary referendum, but who have failed abysmally in the fight against poverty and inequality? An SNP who failed in government in all policy areas as they systematically forget the day job and obsess about the Constitution.
A springtime fall of snow greeted Mr Corbyn earlier today when both he and Nicola Sturgeon came to the Scottish Trade Union Conference in Aviemore.
Jeremy Corbyn says he's fighting for every seat in Scotland. The reality is they'll have to fight hard to keep the one MP they have in Scotland at the moment, having lost 40 seats here in the last general election.
There will be no deals with Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP after the election, Mr Corbyn said today, while she claims her party provide the only effective opposition to a Conservative government.
The SNP simply cannot form a government in Westminster. The only way to get rid of the Tories that you so despise would be with a Labour government, wouldn't it?
Well, look, I can read the polls as well as anybody can, and, the travails of the Labour Party, I think, tell most people that Labour is not on course to form a government. So people who don't want to see Theresa May with a strengthened hand to impose more welfare cuts, to damage the economy, to do further damage to our society should vote SNP.
The SNP regard the Tories, not Labour, as their real opponents in this election.
The fact is, it's never been more important for people across Scotland to think clearly and ask ourselves this question: how can we best protect Scotland from the hardline Tories? The truth is, the Tories are starting to think that they can do whatever they want to Scotland and get away with it.
The Scottish Tories believe they could win up to 12 seats in Scotland and say only they can stop an independence referendum.
Nicola Sturgeon is going to use all means possible, including this election, to try and further her aim for another second independence referendum. The last time Jeremy Corbyn was in Scotland, he said a second independence referendum was absolutely fine with him. So people across the country don't want it, and they want someone to stand up and say no. That's what me and my Conservative team will do.
The SNP claim this is a two-horse race between them and the Tories in Scotland. The Conservatives agree. And in a campaign dominated by arguments over independence, Labour often struggle to get their message heard. Sarah Smith, BBC News, Aviemore.
While Mr Corbyn was campaigning in Scotland, he was being accused by the Conservatives of being a security risk because of his long-standing views on nuclear weapons. Today's campaigning also saw the UKIP leader, Paul Nuttall, giving the strongest hint yet that he may not stand in the election, as the party unveiled its policy on integration, which opponents said was deeply divisive and damaging. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, has more details.
Putting his name to long, deeply held principles, or signing Labour's chances away.
Sign away the Trade Union Act, all right?
Jeremy Corbyn ain't changing. Not on nuclear weapons, despite his party's official support for Trident, nor staunch backing for trades unions around the country.
You are our DNA, you are our family, and we will never, ever apologise for the closeness of our relationship with you. That's why one of the very first things we will do when forming our Labour government will be to repeal the Tory Trade Union Act.
Corbyn's supporters would be aghast at anything else, but the Tories believe he's out of touch with the majority. Content today to make that case not their own. Not even a sign of the Prime Minister, only her Defence Secretary on the road.
He's already now said he wouldn't necessarily endorse strikes against terrorism. That means Labour is a security risk to this country.
The Tories believe UKIP's on the run too. Since the referendum, their main reason for being has gone. So they're arguing for a burqa ban, no more Islamic schools. Hardly speaking softly. They call it integration. Their rivals say it's Islamophobia.
What we want to see is people sign up to British law, sign up to a British way of life, and indeed enjoy the full fruits our great society has to offer. Kill it dead.
The UKIP leader less keen to chat about his own future, chased by reporters for an answer on whether he will stand as an MP. At the other end of the spectrum, the Lib Dems think there's hope from their opposition to Brexit. They believe they can gobble up votes in parts of the country that voted Remain. They're promising a second referendum on the final Brexit deal.
We have, if you like, a coalition of chaos. Conservatives, Labour and UKIP, all lined up, backing the hardest of all Brexits, exit from the single market and cutting off all our ties with our friends and neighbours in Europe.
Yet even among usually mild-mannered Lib Dems, there were heckles today as Tim Farron faced questions about gay rights. Polite politics in this campaign? Maybe not in 2017.
It's still a scramble for all the main parties to get their machines up and running. No one's campaign is yet running at full pelt. But the broad thrust of how they want to get you on board, their strategies, well, those are crystal clear. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Vauxhall.
Police in Greater Manchester are questioning a 21-year-old man about the murder of a former Royal Navy officer who was run over as he tried to stop his car being stolen. Mike Samwell, who was 35, was found with serious injuries during the early hours of Sunday morning and died later in hospital. Our correspondent Danny Savage has the story.
Mike Samwell, a 35-year-old former Royal Navy officer. He and his wife were asleep in their home in Chorlton in the early hours of yesterday when they were awoken by intruders. He went to investigate. What happened in the following few moments saw Mr. Samwell run over by his own car and killed. The high-powered Audi S3 was soon found abandoned a few miles away. Where Mike Samwell was fatally injured is now the scene of a murder inquiry. leaving neighbours and friends at a loss.
He was such a nice bloke, we all liked him. He was very friendly, always talkative, funny, and I really liked him. I'm shocked, really shocked about this.
Mike Samwell was a weapons officer on a nuclear submarine. He left the Navy a few years ago and then worked as an engineer. Police initially appealed to the criminal fraternity for information, saying this crime had crossed the line. Then this morning they announced that a 21-year-old man had been arrested on suspicion of murder. Neighbours say they heard Mike Samwell's wife, Jessica, shouting his name and screaming for help after he was run over. She returned to the scene today, escorted by police into her own home, which is now a crime scene. As investigations continue into what happened in this quiet suburban street. Danny Savage, BBC News, Manchester.
In Syria, the battle against so-called Islamic State is gathering pace as forces move towards the group's stronghold of Raqqa. Territory which has been under IS control is being retaken, including the northern town of Dabiq, which featured heavily in the group's propaganda, as it was the town where the British-born militant known as Jihadi John carried out some of his executions. Our Middle East correspondent Quentin Somerville and cameraman Fred Scott have been to Dabiq, and they sent this report.
In northern Aleppo, the so-called Islamic State predicted the end of days. And here it has come to pass. This is hallowed ground for IS, but it's no longer theirs. The tiny village of Dabiq was a beacon, drawing in foreign fighters from across the globe. Dabiq was a great symbol for the Islamic State group. It's here the Prophet Muhammad said that Muslims would defeat the Romans. This is also the spot where Britain's Jihadi John murdered the American aid worker Peter Kasich. IS were right about one thing though. This is a place of reckoning, but it's the place of their defeat. They've now been driven more than 100 kilometres from here, and these days they don't make much mention of Dabiq. Nearby, there's the city of Al-Bab. IS are gone, but there's another enemy for the Free Syrian Army. It's the Syrian regime. There's a wary truce on these front lines. The regime are only 150 metres away. Airstrikes are no longer a threat, but the Islamic State's roadside bombs and booby traps are everywhere. The FSA, they're mostly ethnic Turks in this part of Syria, fought here to drive out IS, but also to stop their blood enemies, the Kurds, from taking the city. The rebuilding of Al-Bab is already underway. In Syria, it takes a lot of confidence to replace your windows. But the damage done here isn't just to buildings. It extends deeper into Syria's ethnic fabric. Amid the ruins, this was an IS headquarters. You find reminders of the victims, the disappeared, the lost, and the dead. New and rich wells of hatred are being formed. Inside these four walls, the country's hopelessness is revealed. Rare access to enemies and sometime allies locked up together. In these cells, the prisoners agreed to speak to us. Some say they're from IS. Others, no more than boys, fought for the Kurds with American backing. And some for President Assad, helped by Russia.
Because of the joblessness in Syria, I had no salary to look after my children. So I had to join the fighting. Foreign interference here has only caused more destruction. People are killing each other.
Some say they came to fight for IS, others to destroy it.
The different people and groups here despise each other more and more. War only increases hatred, it never lessens it.
All the prisoners, IS included, have had regular contact with their families. These men will likely be exchanged in a prisoner swap. The war with IS may be approaching an end, but there will be no rest in Syria, and the people who make up this country will likely find themselves pushed even further apart. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Northern Aleppo.
Campaigners for better air quality have accused ministers of pure political expediency and of presiding over a public health emergency. It follows a decision to delay publishing plans to tackle air pollution until after the general election. Ministers had originally been given until today to publish their proposals, following growing concern about the level of emissions, especially from diesel cars. Our science editor, David Schuckman, has the story.
It begins with one small cloud. But multiply that by the millions of vehicles on the roads, and you can see how pollution builds up in our cities. There's growing evidence now of the impacts on our health, and successive governments have been under pressure to clean up. What this is all about is a gas called nitrogen dioxide that's given off by traffic. It's invisible, but damaging. So the European Union says the air we breathe shouldn't contain more than 40 micrograms of it on average over the course of a year. Well, here are some of the most recent figures. London, 125. West Midlands, 73. Glasgow, 71. And West Yorkshire, 65. The pollution is so bad at Camelford in Cornwall, the council even considered moving people away. Nottingham is building an express lane for electric vehicles. All this as the government had been told to publish a new clean air plan today. An environmental group had taken it to court and won. The ministers say they now have to wait till after the election, and campaigners aren't happy.
We've been breaking the law on air pollution now for 7 years, and the government's had 5 months to come up with new policies to try and sort it out, and now they're leaving it till the last minute to try and get out of it. That's just not acceptable.
If the government fails to
In the Commons, Labour accused the government of using the election as an excuse for delay.
Isn't it the case that the government is doing everything it can to avoid scrutiny because it is missing its own commitments, has no strategy and wants to yet again kick this issue into the long grass?
The Environment Secretary said the government was ready to act, but couldn't right now because of election campaign rules known as PERDA.
Clean air is an absolute top priority for this government. We have been working on our new proposals for the last 5 months, and we are ready to go with our proposals. We are now seeking a very short deferral to meet the propriety rules around PERDA.
When it emerges, the Clean Air Plan will have to tackle the vast numbers of diesels. More than a third of all cars in Britain are diesels. That's 12 million. The last Labour government encouraged people to buy them. One option now is a subsidy to scrap the dirtiest ones, but that's expensive. Another idea is to have taxes to deter diesel drivers from entering cities. Choices that are very difficult at any time. David Schuckman, BBC News.
Let's have a brief look at some of the day's other news stories now then. The law firm Lee Day has appeared before a disciplinary tribunal on misconduct charges in connection with claims it brought against British troops during the Iraq War. The tribunal was told that the firm knew that their Iraqi clients were not innocent civilians when it represented them in compensation cases. The firm denies any wrongdoing. Two men, Arthur Collins, pictured here, and Andre Phoenix, been remanded in custody after being charged in connection with an alleged acid attack at a London nightclub over Easter. More than 20 people were injured, with the two of the victims partially blinded. Tougher punishments for the most serious cases of speeding have come into force in England and Wales. Drivers may now be fined 1.5 times their weekly wage for the worst offences, including driving over 50 miles an hour in a 30-mile-an-hour zone or at 100 miles an hour on a motorway. Now, James Mattis, the US Defence Secretary, has warned that Afghan security forces and the international troops supporting them face a tough year because of the threat from the Taliban. Mr. Mattis is in Kabul, where the Afghan Defence Minister and the Army Chief of Staff have resigned following Friday's Taliban attack on a military base. The assault near Mazar-e-Sharif killed more than 140 people after militants, disguised as soldiers, stormed an army base there. Our correspondent Justin Rowlatt has been to the camp and he sent this report.
This is the route the Taliban attackers took. The guards waved them through, believing they were fellow Afghan soldiers. We're the first journalists invited onto the army base, the first to see the horror unleashed here. A suicide bomber blew himself up in the dining hall as hundreds of soldiers ate their lunch. Others were mown down as they left Friday prayers, the Taliban shooting fellow Muslims dead as they worshipped. Once inside here, they just opened fire, and if you look around here, you can see the walls are pocked with gunshot fire. And outside, one of the vehicles the Taliban used. There are suspicions the attackers had inside help, something the base commander denied.
Investigators from Kabul have been here. They confirm there are no indications that there has been any infiltration of the base.
But just hours after our interview, he was suspended. 8 army personnel are under investigation, and today both the Afghan Defence Minister and the Army Chief of Staff resigned. There could scarcely have been a worse day for the US Defence Secretary, James Mattis, to visit the country. He met the Afghan president to discuss US strategy in Afghanistan.
I'd say that we're under no illusions about the challenges associated with this mission. 2017 is going to be another tough year for the valiant Afghan security forces and the international troops who have stood and will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Afghanistan against terrorism.
But as they begin to clear up the wreckage, the Americans were still making no promises on what the Afghans really want: additional US troops to assist Afghan forces. Justin Rolat, BBC News, Mazar-i-Sharif, Afghanistan.
The American astronaut Peggy Whitson has broken the record for the number of days spent in space by an American. President Trump telephoned her to congratulate her on beating the previous record of 534 days. Commander Whitson is also the first woman to command the International Space Station on 2 separate missions. Some football news, and Newcastle United have been promoted back to the Premier League at the first attempt following their relegation last season. United beat Preston 4-1 at St James's Park this evening to secure the second automatic promotion spot behind the leaders, Brighton. Katie Gornall was watching the action.
The season hasn't been the procession that many expected at Newcastle United, but their life is rarely dull on Tyneside. With regular crowds of over 50,000, this is a club that feels like it belongs in the Premier League. One more win and they'd be back. Much of this is down to Rafa Benitez, the Champions League winning manager who chose to stay in the Championship, believing he could take them straight up. And the prize was in sight after just 6 minutes, as Oyosi Perez got the party started. Newcastle beat Preston 6-0 in October, but this time their opponents were far more resilient, and Jordan Hugill made sure it would be no walkover. At 1-1, nerves were starting to build at St James's Park. In such a cauldron, what was needed was a cool head. From Newcastle, that came from Christian Atsu, firing them back in front. After the break, Newcastle were back on the attack, with Preston forced to take drastic action. Now down to 10 men, Matt Ritchie punished them further. It was so close they could taste it. Newcastle would score a fourth before the celebrations really started. Often described as sleeping giants, maybe now they've found the right manager to prod them awake. So a year after they were relegated, Newcastle are promoted at the first time of asking, something that doesn't happen all that often. Now it looks like with 2 games to go, Brighton will pip them to the title, although given the way that everyone's celebrated here at the final whistle, second place doesn't seem like a bad prize. Hugh.
Katie, thanks very much again. Katie Gornall there with the result at St James's Park. Well, the runner who provided the defining image of yesterday's London Marathon when he sacrificed his own race time to help another competitor says it was the perfect ending to his race. The actions of Matthew Rees in helping David Wyeth to reach the finishing line have been described as a great example of true sportsmanship. Our correspondent Dan Johnson has caught up with the 2 runners and spoken to them today.
On the final bend, on his last legs.
David Wyeth goes down.
After 26 miles, a helping hand summed up the spirit of the marathon, shared by so many.
But there'll be guys who'll help him to the line. It's that sort of event.
I was just trying to get to the line, and my body went. I went to the ground. It was desperate, really desperate. But thankfully Matthew came along.
He was saying that he was determined to finish, and I helped him up and his legs went again. So I realised that I was going to have to stay with him to make sure that he did get to that finish line.
Against him to see it through to the conclusion of this 26-mile, 385-yard course.
What did you actually say to him?
I was like shouting in his ear, saying, come on, you can do this. It's 200 metres. We will finish. I'll stay with you. Maybe I was a bit overzealous with my support, but...
No, it was wonderful. It was needed. It needed to kind of hit home. Matthew was clear in knowing if he leaves me, there's a chance that they will just whisk me off. They won't get me along the finish. And that's just, you know, it's just so nice, and it's such a gentleman for doing that.
The killer question, roles reversed, would you have done the same, David?
Oh my goodness, I honestly, that is you're the first person to ask me that today, and that is such a good question. I haven't given that a moment's thought. I'd love to think I would.
You can see Prince William and Prince Harry looking out and just in disbelief.
What the general public see there is the spirit of the running community, and this happens all over the place. It just happened that there were quite a few cameras trained on that, and at that point in the course, capturing that moment.
And it was even the wobbly pair of legs that officially crossed the line first. David's clubs offered to pay Matthew's entry next year with first-class travel and accommodation. Recognition of a new friendship forged in a selfless moment of sacrifice. Dan Johnson, BBC News, London.
Well, Newsnight's about to begin on BBC Two. In a few moments, here's Kirsty for you.
In the aftermath of the first round of the French presidential elections, Peter Mandelson talks about what hope he thinks Emmanuel Macron gives the left in France and here, and talks about his new cross-party movement to defeat pro-Brexit MPs at the election. Join me now on BBC Two.
That's Newsnight with Kirsty here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.